Today is February 3rd, 2025, and yesterday Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow, so we will have 6 more weeks of winter. That does have nothing to do with what I'm talking about today, though. However, today I wanted to talk about our special assessments, and specifically in the boxes that we write on our purchase and sale agreement for the special assessments and what that means. There can be some big implications for checking that little tiny box. So why do we check the box for special assessments? Why are they not just utility charges? Why aren't we just seeing them as a normal utility charge where they are prorated and taken over by the buyer? Special assessments are things that are done above and beyond what the normal usage charge is for something like a utility or an HOA. They are something that's done in addition to. And a lot of times it's in addition to because they have something to do with an upgrade or some sort of benefit that provides that home that had that assessment. So these are additional charges for an improvement that will be benefited by the homeowner. These charges must be disclosed if they are going to be actively charged. So once the charge is actively done, that is considered levied. Sometimes we don't have an assessment that has been levied, so it's considered a pending assessment, meaning the charge has not been yet enacted, but it's in the works and it's going to be enacted. The pending assessments, if anything is known, should be disclosed to a buyer or potential buyer. And the seller also needs to be aware that there are things in the works. So failing to disclose this could open up your client to a potential lawsuit. So that being said, and that being it could be a potentially severe consequence of having these huge financial burdens, I want to go into depth and talk about exactly what happens with special assessments. So first of all, our purchase and sale agreement has a place to mark special assessments and to allocate who does pay for it. And it's in this very tiny box right here. And if you can't see it, I've zoomed right in here. So here it is, the tiny box that holds our client's future in its hands. This box will determine the outcome of potential large balances that are due at closing. Make sure that you are not missing this box. Most agents don't really know what they're doing when checking this box or understand the full implications of what's happening. So I'm hoping to go through that in detail with this class and explain what it means when you check each of those boxes so you can make sure you truly are checking the box that you intend to do. So we're going to dive into that right now. What does it mean when a buyer is assuming an assessment, and what does it mean when a seller is prepaying in full? So we do have an explanation for this at our fingertips from the manual. So the manual says specifically that this applies to any local improvement district capacity or impact charges or other assessments that are levied before closing but become due after closing. I had to really break that down because I personally didn't really understand what the difference was between levied before, due after. What does this all mean? Let's go to paragraph 2 really quick, and then I will explain how to think about these things. If a charge or assessment is levied before closing but does not become due till after, then the parties need to agree who's going to pay for it. There are examples of this in our forms manual that I'm not necessarily going to go over, but the basic rule of thumb is if there is a charge on record, the seller is going to need to disclose this charge, and then in that time, it can be negotiated as to who pays for what. By default, the seller may be responsible for charges up until the closing, and remaining balance could transfer to buyer. It needs to be known as to who's going to pay. There are certain assessments that cannot be paid by a buyer. There are certain assessments that must be paid in full at closing, and they just need to know who's going to pay them. But this is going to apply for anything like our forms manual said, a limited improvement district. So LID, a charge that's from an LID, this would be a special assessment charge. This is not a normal utility charge. If you see capacity charges for sewer impact charges, assessments that are just flat out named assessments, or anything that's recorded on the title as an encumbrance. So the seller's responsibility by default is to pay basically these outstanding balances. Think of it like a credit card. or some sort of charge that the seller has accrued during their ownership. So if a seller charged something on their credit card before closing, then that seller is responsible for the entire balance, whether those payments were stretched out 1 month or 10 years. So assessments are automatically done with the seller as the benefiter to what's being finished. So therefore, the seller by default is the one responsible paying for those things. So this includes all sorts of assessments, but I wanted to also bring to you the attention that it doesn't have to be a short assessment. It could be a long one. So anything that was levied in 2023, due in 2033, if it closes before 2033, you may be putting that all on the seller's shoulders as a final balance to be paid in full at the transfer of the sale. If an assessment was done in 2024 and you're going to close it in 2025, the seller will have paid the full assessment. So the seller would have taken all the responsibility for that as well. Or if you see anything that's recorded on the title as an encumbrance, so make sure we're checking title. We're going to be looking at all of the things that are attached, any sort of HOA that has pull, anybody who can charge any sort of assessments or do any sort of charge, upgrade, or anything on the title report. Things that need to be decided in line 13. These are things that are above and beyond normal usage for normal utilities. These are improvements to utilities or repairs. There's a large list of things that could fall within this category, so I'm trying not to bullet point out too many things for just to be general. But if you see something like a sewer capacity charge that's being charged over several years, that is something that is due after closing, has been decided what was being charged before closing, so would be needing to line out in line 13. You will need to specify who pays that. Irrigation lines for a neighborhood, say they decided before closing, and it could be right before closing or it could be years before closing. But let's say in this example, it was months or years before closing. The neighborhood was getting new irrigation lines for their water. And that balance was supposed to be paid out over the following 10 or 15 years. That entire balance would be due at closing by the party allocated in number 13. Water improvement districts may do a charge over several years. If there's any improvement to the water that's done as an assessment and not as a normal charge, then those balances would also need to be lined out in number 13. Condo improvement assessments as well. Those are probably the ones that we most commonly see over in Snohomish and King County. So those types of things would also need to be lined out as to who's going to pay the balance. Now, we do have some neighborhoods close to my area that will not allow a buyer to assume that. They are requiring the seller does pay these assessments in full should they choose to sell their house before that is due. So anytime you see an assessment, it's a good idea just to get a phone call into escrow, a phone call into whoever's doing that. The number one response from the legal hotline on assessments is to seek an attorney. So all we can do right now as agents is just identify that there may be a potential issue and then try to work out how to communicate that with the other side. If anything beyond this should have a lasting effect or an impact whatsoever, they're going to have to see somebody that has an expertise in this area, which unfortunately is not us as real estate agents. Now, here's an example of something I just wanted to pull up. What about this? Who's responsible for informing a condo buyer of an upcoming special assessment during the purchase of the condo? A special assessment was to begin in January, but she was never notified during the purchase process. So it sounds like in this situation, an assessment was in the works as a pending special assessment and then was not notified to that buyer. And once closed, now the buyer is being notified that there is, in fact, an assessment coming up. With condos, remember that we do deliver the resale certificate, which should have and should disclose any known assessments. If the certificate was due but never delivered, there may be claims against that. This is getting into the nitty-gritty about what rights does this buyer have. Ultimately, the buyer needs to figure out if they were in fact informed correctly. And if so, if they were informed and they had been on notice, what responsibilities the buyer may carry. So this is one of the non-answers. Escrow will notify if there is a special assessment that they find during their closing documents. So when you have escrow doing your 22K, which is another great reason to fill it out, they will contact all of the people who are listed on 22K or listed within the title as having any sort of lienable rights to the property. In doing so, they send out a form for them to fill out, and it specifically asks, are there any pending special assessments? If escrow is notified of special assessments or anything pending, they will notify all the parties involved, at which point agents need to probably communicate with each other and find out who is going to pay for those pending special assessments. So in this example right here, an agent receives a condo resale certificate. There is nothing regarding the special assessment within that documentation. Later, the agent receives an email from Escrow regarding an ongoing special assessment within the complex. The initial 5-day period for the resale certificate has passed. Does this new information give the buyer a new 5-day right to review and amend and have this amended? Resale certificates are not the same as HOA documents when it comes to how we receive them. So in this case, it is possible that the buyer has the right to complete the purchase, but not necessarily have to be responsible for that special assessment because it was not included in the resale certificate. However, it's also possible that the buyer could have been on notice because they had received information from escrow regarding this special assessment. In either case, it's unclear what rights the buyer would have at this point. So our job is to avoid getting to this conversation of, I just found this out, now what do I do? Because from this point forward, from this example, they're going to be talking to an attorney versus us. We as agents, if knowing that there's a special assessment, can go ahead and just bullet point very clearly who we would like to be responsible for paying what. So how do we as agents know that there is a pending special assessment or even one currently in the works? Number one, we have to rely on our sellers. The sellers living there are going to be our number one source of information. So there's a good chance the sellers were probably aware of some sort of fee or charge additionally to their normal usage. And that would probably prompt us to figure out if that's in fact a special assessment or if it's something different. You can always err on the side of caution and say that if there is a pending special assessment, how would we like to check this box? If you know that there is an assessment in place, you can write it on 22K. The 22K is only there to let escrow know that they need to contact these lienable utility companies and get all of the payoffs and get all of the information from that list of people. So go ahead and write it on a 22K. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a great place to go ahead and reference that. The 22D will also be a place where we could potentially find out if there are pending assessments, specifically in the HOA review period. Now, the HOA review period is different from the condo resale certificate. We're going to be getting all the documents that we can. And once our HOA review period is over, that is our limitations on what we can ask for and extend our timelines. There's always time to get additional information, but we cannot use the contingency of the HOA review period should new information come through. Now, the condo resale certificate is another place that we could find information on special assessments. In fact, that is one of the questions that's on there. And an HOA for a condo would know if there's anything in the works. Now, as agents, to be diligent, we should probably also be asking if there's anything that has not yet gone through, but there's discussion of. This would include talks on the meeting minutes. So if you have access to meeting minutes or if you have access to any of the bulletins that the HOAs put out, then that's a great idea as well. But just getting all that information so you can make an informed decision. And again, if you don't have all of it, but you have some of it, erring on the side of caution and checking the box that would be appropriate for doing that. Escrow is going to send out completion sheets. So in their completion sheets, they're going to send that out to, say, a water or sewer company to complete, which will also ask if there are any pending assessments or any that have just been levied. Now, pending assessments and levied assessments are different. So the charges that have been approved and have been started to be enacted are considered levied. Pending assessments means there's talks of having a charge done, but has not yet been active. We're not yet collecting money from people. It's just a talk and a potential thing coming down the pipeline. Once those have been levied, then we need to know what's going to happen at the sale of the house. If everything is just talks and everything is in the works and we're not going to have a charge set into place until after the closing table, then it will automatically become the responsibility of the buyer. Your client may be on the hook for a large balance if these check boxes are done in a way that would put it back on the buyer. So if you're trying to be aggressive with your offer and saying, okay, buyer's going to prepay all of the assessments that are coming down the pipeline, and you don't know if there are any assessments, you could be putting your buyer in a position where they pay several thousands of dollars because of the box you checked, not knowing in advance that there were some assessments that are now going to cost them a lot of money. When it comes to the HOA versus the resale certificate, just remember HOA review on 22D, there is one timeline. That one timeline is all you have for any sort of right of termination based on the information you've received. So in 22D, it says you have the right to receive all of the HOA documents. You have a deadline that those need to be turned in on, and then it gives you a response time. Once that deadline and response time have come and gone, you are no longer allowed to have a right to terminate based on anything that would be in the HOA. So if you went through your entire HOA review period to find there were no assessments, and then 10 days later see, oh, here is an assessment, that will not restart your clock for reviewing those documents. Whether those documents were delivered to you in their entirety or not, your timeline is your timeline. Now, on the flip side, a resale certificate does require all of the documentation to be turned in order to be considered receiving a complete copy. Similar to the Form 17, a complete copy is everything that's listed within the resale certificate and every document that's required to go with it. If the resale certificate is delivered to you without these documents, and then later you find out that there are documents that should have been completed with that resale certificate, it would restart your clock. So in that situation, you would be able to restart your disclosure period where you could read over about the special assessments and potentially have time to figure out what's going to happen at the end of the sale with those. Now, there are some assessments that will not allow a buyer to assume. All assessments should be treated like a debt the seller owes that must be paid, and it must be paid by either the buyer or the seller at the sale of the transfer of the sale or the transfer of ownership of real estate in a transaction. So think of it similarly to a credit card, where the seller would be responsible for the balance unless the buyer agrees to take it on. So not all special assessments can simply just be taken on. Like I said, there are some that will allow a buyer to take it over and potentially continue payments to it. Most special assessments do require the balance to be paid in full on its entirety at closing. So keep these things in mind when it comes to checking the boxes. And if you know of anything in advance, you need to make sure you're making an informed decision on that line. So now going back to that little line on our purchase and sale agreement, knowing some of these implications that I've talked about today, you may want to reconsider how you're filling out these boxes and have these conversations with your clients before escrow has a chance to. I appreciate you listening. Thank you. And have a great day.
Thanks, Jen.